Hey, good morning. Tim Berenga here with WorkSaver, and we're excited to introduce our new Generation 2 electric grapple. Now, the main difference between the first generation and the second generation is we have enhanced the actuator. On our original electric grapples, the actuator was set at 1,000 pounds of force, and when it hit that, it would engage a slip clutch and you would hear it chatter. And the only unfortunate thing with this is two things. One, 1,000 pounds wasn't quite enough force when grabbing some debris, so the operator would have to readjust to get a tight hold on the debris. And the second thing is, if somebody were to misuse the grapple and go into a rooted bush or go into a pile and back drag with it, they could overload the actuator and they would shear a shear pin in there, which then made the actuator inoperable. So what we've done with the second generation actuator is we have eliminated the slip clutch and the shear pin. We have gone to a potentiometer that reads amp draw, and when the actuator hits 38 amps, it just simply shuts off. So there's no more clutch that you have to watch or listen for. When the grapple's done moving, you're done and you're ready to carry. But by doing this, we were able to get an extra 1,000 pounds of force. So the new actuator has 2,000 pounds of force, and it still moves at the same speed of 1 inch per second. So you're basically getting double the power out of this new actuator. The other enhancement we made on the actuator was we went to a brushless motor, where the first generation was a brush motor. They're still IP65 sealed, so they can be out in the weather, in the rain, and be washed and everything. But since we have gone to this potentiometer, that has changed our wiring harness. So the original Generation 1 just had an Anderson connector on the back of the grapple that you would connect and disconnect. But since we're using the potentiometer, we still have the Anderson connector for our power, but then we have a 4-wire cable that runs down the back. That is your directional wires, your forward, your back, your hot, and your neutral. So that's changed our wiring harness a little bit. So the difference in the wiring harness is now we have two separate harnesses. So from the battery, we run, and this is our main power to power the actuator. That runs from the battery to the grapple. On the directional control, I mentioned earlier, we have the 4-pin connector that has your forward, reverse, hot, and neutral. And then that runs back to our universal mount that mounts on the joystick. And then an enhancement we made on Gen 1 about halfway through, and we've incorporated with Gen 2, is we went to a sealed switch instead of a rocker switch. That way, if this is left out in the weather, it's sealed and won't be bothered by moisture or humidity. So the reason for an electric grapple is a lot of your smaller tractors under 32 horsepower do not have auxiliary hydraulics. So with the electric actuator, you're just running power from the battery to run the actuator and still getting the function of a hydraulic cylinder. Now, if you have to go and add a third function kit onto the tractor, it can be quite expensive, and that's the reason that we offer this solution instead of having to install hydraulics on your tractor. So as I mentioned earlier, the new electric actuator has a potentiometer in there, and so it's going to ramp up, and then once it hits 38 amps, it's going to stop. So we're going to go ahead and open and close this for you, and we're still moving at the same speed as Generation 1, which is 1 inch per second. So it's an 8-inch stroke, so that's 8 seconds to open, 8 seconds to close. But when you hear this, you'll hear, like I said, the motor ramp up, and then when it gets to end of stroke, or later when we're encountering loads and it hits 38 amps, it shuts off. So both with our John Deere and our skid steer models, we have a 48-inch wide frame, a 28.5-inch wide clamp, and when it's fully open, you have 31 inches from this point to that point. And for 32 horsepower tractors and smaller, it's a great opening and handle the size of brush your tractor can handle. Another important thing to remember is when you're moving brush and debris is you always want to have ballast on the back end. So you want to put some type of implement on the back end, a weight box, a box blade, a rotary cutter, just so the tractor has enough weight in the rear, and when you're going in and moving brush, you don't lift the rear end of the tractor off, which could result in a possible tip over. So with electric actuators, they all have the same opportunity, and that is you cannot side load an actuator. If you do, it'll bend the ball screw and then the actuator will become inoperable. So what WorkSaver's done to protect the actuator is we have our patented telescopic tube that will take all the side loading and all the force off the actuator and allows the actuator to push and pull in straight line motion with no side loading. And we have this greasable on both sides with a grease zerk, and then also we have the main clamp greasable here and over here. So when we developed this Generation 2 actuator, we wanted to make sure that we could take care of customers that bought the first generation if they wanted more force from their electric grapple. And so with the Generation 2, the frame and the clamp are exactly the same as the first generation. The actuator assembly, which is this black part here, is the kit that'll upgrade you to the new Generation 2, and that comes with the actuator, the telescopic tubes, the shielding, and the wiring harness. And that can be purchased at WorkSaver, and it'll be a direct plug and play for your Generation 1 grapple. Now when it comes time to disconnect the grapple, we tried to make it as easy as we can. We didn't want you to have to take the wiring harness on and off the tractor, so that's why we have the connectors right at the grapple, so the wiring harness can stay on the tractor. You can disconnect them in the back, put the parking stand down, ungauge the attachment method, and leave the grapple there. So I'm going to do that for you now. All right, so to disconnect our grapple, we'll disconnect the power source first, and we have the covers that cover the unit, keep dirt and dust and water out, and then we disconnect the 4-pin connector, and then we take our parking stand, we install that in the bottom. And then we will disconnect the attachment method, where with John Deere you got the 2 linch pins, with the skid steer you got the 2 handles.